The foundation of the basic canopy flight program is the pattern. Flying this pattern helps you evaluate your landing progress and maintain separation from other traffic. Thorough ground preparation will help you do your best in the air. To prepare, set up a mock drop zone with markers for the opening point, the setup point, and the target. Start at the opening point and begin the sequence after canopy deployment.
Let's start this practice with your normal opening routine, including a traffic check.
As you proceed toward the target, practice the flight sequences as they are outlined in the workbook. Upwind of the target, check the winds and decide on the correct approach pattern. Enter the pattern at the key point by turning onto the downwind leg.
Remember, fly your downwind and base in half brakes.
As you near the turn onto base, anticipate the wind's effect on your ground track.
The wind is pushing you downwind. What will you do?
Crab this way.
Turn on to final over the setup point, look at the approach angle, and check your altitude.
You realize you were overshooting.
So I'll do a figure 8.
Fly the figure 8 in medium brakes and be smooth on the controls during the flat turns. If the wind is affecting your ground track, compensate by crabbing so you arrive back at the original setup point, then turn final. Fly the figure 8 until the approach angle and altitude are correct, then face into the wind for a flared landing. In the air, check your canopy and, if it's necessary, use the rear risers to steer away from other traffic. Once you are in the clear, release the deployment brakes and try a flight control check. If you are under a flying and controllable canopy, thoroughly check all around you for traffic, then proceed with your flight plan. As you perform the turns in Exercise 1, work on smooth control movements during the entry, a gradual heading change for a minimum bank angle during the turn, and a smooth recovery on heading. When you practice the figure 8 turn sequence, carefully note your altitude before you start. During the turns, keep the bank angle shallow by using smooth control movements and a gradual heading change. Hold each heading for a moment between the turns so you can look around you for traffic. As you complete the sequence by turning back into the wind, check your altimeter. The altitude you lost during the sequence is the minimum amount of altitude required to fly the pattern. You'll need this information when you fly the figure 8 at the setup point. On Jump 2, refine your flat turn technique as it's outlined in the workbook. A flat turn can be performed by pulling a toggle down or by letting the opposite toggle up. Try both techniques to find the one that works the best with your canopy. If you're flying in deep brakes, though, turn by letting the opposite toggle up to prevent a stall. Medium bank turns are performed using a greater toggle offset. You can immediately notice the additional bank angle, and you may perceive an increased rate of descent as well. Try turning with a fast control movement and note the result. Some canopies may enter the turn very fast with a resulting high bank angle. As you practice, refine your control inputs to turn quickly with a medium bank angle and the lowest rate of descent. Before entering the pattern, use wind indicators on the ground to determine whether conditions have changed since the takeoff. If the winds are the same, follow your original flight plan. If the wind has changed direction since takeoff, merely shift the pattern to maintain correct orientation for an approach and landing into the wind. Check for traffic, apply medium brakes, and enter the downwind leg by flying a heading parallel to the wind line. As you fly the downwind, look down to check your ground track and crab if it's necessary to correct for drift. When you check your drift, note the wind's effect on your ground speed. If your ground speed is high, begin the turn to the base leg early to avoid overshooting the desired track to the setup point. Fly the turn with a shallow bank to remain under the canopy and in control. On the base leg, maintain a perpendicular ground track toward the wind line. A higher wind speed requires a larger crab angle. If you reach 300 feet before arriving at the setup point, turn into the wind and prepare for landing. If you reach the setup point at or very close to 300 feet, turn onto the final approach. If you're too high at the setup point and you'll overshoot the target, make sure there's no other traffic and use the figure 8 to adjust your altitude. Fly in medium brakes and, after entering the maneuver, make all of the turns of the figure 8 into the wind to minimize drift and allow you to see the target at all times. Remember, the figure 8 is a ground track maneuver, and the return path is to your original setup point. In higher winds, the turns are less than 180 degrees, and you'll need to crab to maintain the correct ground track. After turning into the wind at the setup point, check your approach angle and altitude. If you're too high and have enough altitude, fly another figure 8. If your altitude and distance are correct, fly straight ahead to land. As soon as you're on final approach and headed toward the target, let the toggles up to the full flight position and maintain your heading directly into the wind for landing. In a proper ram air landing, airspeed is converted into lift just before the touchdown. For the softest landing, flare to achieve the minimum rate of descent and forward speed just before your feet touch the ground. Breaking past this point causes the canopy to sink and results in a harder landing. The best flare technique depends on the canopy you jump. During the flare, watch the ground for the change in your glide angle as you extend the toggles. If the glide angle remains the same but the speed and descent are slowing, continue the flare to finish just as you touch down. Large, lightly loaded wings have a slow forward speed and a low rate of descent even in full flight, so a smooth, continuous toggle stroke quickly flares the canopy for a soft landing. If the glide flattens out and you float, hold partial brakes as the canopy slows and starts to sink. Then continue the flare to finish as you touch down. If your forward speed and rate of descent do not slow, flare faster. A late or slow flare may cause a firm landing depending on your forward speed and rate of descent. If you flare late, be careful. A fast flare can result in the canopy quickly ballooning to quite a spectacular height. This is a yahoo if you know what you're doing, or an ouch if you don't. If you flare just right, though, you'll have the slowest airspeed and rate of descent at touchdown. Your ground speed on landing depends on the wind. If the winds are very light, you'll have to take a few steps when you land. The wind affects every ram air flight. In this module, you'll learn to judge the winds at altitude and on the ground, and adjust your pattern for an accurate landing. During the ground preparation, walk through the flight path for both light and medium wind conditions. Your initial assessment of the wind speed and direction allows you to plan your progress toward the landing area as you perform the flight exercises. Prior to entering the pattern, a final check is made of both the upper winds and the ground winds.
What will you do at the decision point?
I'm assessing the winds to choose my pattern.
And if the ground track was straight ahead, what pattern would you choose?
Low winds.
Excellent.
In light winds, the approach pattern is square, and the key point for pattern entry is directly abeam the target. On the downwind, keep the pattern square by flying a ground track aligned parallel with the wind. After you turn base and head for the setup point, your heading and the ground track are nearly the same. This is further confirmation that the wind speed is low. Maintain your awareness of other traffic and turn final over the low wind setup point. Let your toggles all the way up to full flight, control your heading to stay directly on the wind line, and flare for a soft landing. When you check for drift in medium winds, your ground track and heading may differ by as much as 45 degrees. The key point for pattern entry in medium winds is diagonally upwind of the target, and the downwind leg is flown closer to the wind line. On the base leg, a distinct crab angle is required to fly the correct perpendicular ground track. The setup point for the turn-on to final is closer to the target, and the resulting approach angle is steeper. In the air, complete your after-opening routine, confirm your ability to hold, and thoroughly scan all around you for conflicting traffic. Then check the upper wind direction by turning downwind to face the target, and look down to note your ground track. If your heading and ground track are the same, you are on the wind line. If you are tracking to the right or left of your heading, you are off the wind line. and need to crab toward the key point for entry into the pattern. To estimate the wind strength, turn 90 degrees to the wind, apply medium brakes, and check your drift. In light winds, your ground track and heading are nearly the same. If the ground track is close to 45 degrees from your heading, you are on medium wind conditions, since your forward speed and the wind speed are nearly equal. If your ground track is considerably beyond 45 degrees from your present heading, let the brakes up and return to full flight. If the ground track changes to an angle of less than 45 degrees, you are in high winds, but they don't exceed your canopy's forward speed. Check your position and, if necessary, fly back to directly upwind from the landing area. Next, judge your glide angle to the target. While you are 90 degrees to the wind, focus on the target and note whether it is stationary, moving up, or moving down in your field of vision. If the target is relatively stationary and the angle to that point remains constant, you are headed directly to the target, and your position is ideal for the present winds. If the target is moving down in your field of vision and the angle to that point becomes steep, you are overshooting and are too close for the wind speed. If the target is moving up in your field of vision and the angle to that point becomes shallow, you are undershooting and need to proceed toward the target at the canopy's best glide. In Exercise 1, use the stationary spot technique to find the brake position that produces the flattest glide for the existing wind conditions. In downwind flight, the stronger the wind speed, the more the brakes can be applied to flatten the glide angle and travel the greatest distance. When you explore medium and deep brake flight, take note of all the sensations you experience and relate them to the canopy's performance. For instance, as the brakes are applied, the wind noise diminishes. As additional airspeed is lost, reduced pressure inside the cells results in a noticeable distortion of the canopy's lower surface. When you practice steady-state stalls, watch for the transition from floating to sinking to stalling, and take note of the toggle travel in this range. Be smooth on the controls to avoid a surge during the stall recovery. Before you reach the decision point, perform a final drift check to verify the winds and confirm the pattern. Track to the key point and enter the pattern in medium brakes just as you practiced on the ground. In the pattern, alternately scan for traffic, check your ground track, and judge your angle to the target to continue to develop approach perception. If necessary, adjust your altitude at the setup point with the figure 8. On the final approach, maintain a straight ground track down the wind line at full flight, concentrate on the target center, and watch your glide angle. If the target is stationary, your approach angle is nearly perfect. Fly straight ahead to land. If the target is moving up, you are undershooting. Look for the stationary point to find your probable touchdown spot, and after landing, note the undershoot distance. If the target is moving down, you are overshooting. Again, find the stationary spot where you will touch down, and after landing, note the overshoot distance. You'll use this information in the next module to adjust the setup point. Flying the correct pattern for the prevailing wind conditions is the key to accurate landings. You know how to adjust the pattern for the winds. In this module, you'll learn to pick the best setup point. During your ground preparation, practice the corrections for approaches which are too high and too low.
In these exercises, you will learn to adjust your pattern to arrive at the setup point by 300 feet. If you're flying downwind and the angle to your target looked low, what would you do?
I'll cut the corner and turn onto my base leg early.
Well done. Let's try another example. On your downwind, as you're arriving at your base point, you realize that the angle to the target is steep. What would you do?
I'd fly a curved base leg to lengthen the distance to the setup point.
As you walk the pattern, practice judging your angle to the target to determine whether you are high or low. Make adjustments on the base leg to arrive at the setup point by 300 feet. If you're a bit low, cut the corner and turn on to base leg early to shorten the distance to the setup point. If you're a bit high, fly a curved base leg to slightly lengthen the distance. Fly the final in the best configuration for your canopy and flare from full flight for a soft landing. The maneuvers in this module generate high airspeeds and rates of descent. Look all around you, especially below, to make absolutely sure you are clear of traffic. During the full glide turns, notice the point at which the turn transitions to a spiral, and pay particular attention to using smooth control movements during entry and recovery. Note that you can perform turns and spirals quite smoothly by avoiding rapid, jerky toggle movements. When you do the flare turns, start with gentle control movements. Then progressively increase the speed of your turn entry as you monitor the reaction of your particular canopy. Be cautious with dynamic maneuver, since some canopies may react radically. Notice that although the first part of this turn looks well-mannered, the jumper's momentum quickly caused the turn to wind up until opposite toggle started the recovery. Turn reversals help you learn the performance limits of you and your canopy. Again, proceed slowly and be alert for the possibility of line twists as a result of overly aggressive turn entries. By the time you advance to dynamic stalls, you should have a very well-developed feel for the reaction of your particular canopy. Use your increased flight skill to smoothly recover from the stall, keeping the canopy over your head with a minimum forward surge. If the canopy has collapsed end cells following a stall recovery, brake application will correct the problem. At the decision point, assess the winds and select the best approach pattern. Apply medium brakes at the key point and fly the pattern as consistently as possible. As you fly the downwind leg, continually judge your angle to the target. If your altitude in the pattern appears low, turn onto the base leg early. If the angle to the target is steep and you're too high, fly a curved base leg. These pattern adjustments should allow you to arrive at the planned setup point at 300 feet. At the setup point, check for traffic and turn on to final. If your canopy sinks well, fly in a medium sink. If you jump a floaty canopy, fly at full flight. In turbulence, slight heading corrections are necessary to stay on the wind line. On the approach, watch your glide angle to continue to develop approach perception. Make sure you're at full flight by 100 feet and end the flight with a flared landing. Use the missed distance to adjust the setup point on subsequent jumps. Flying the correct pattern for the